this afternoon that you all are joining us if you're in the US around your lunchtime. I'm Terry. I'm one of the owners of Swamp Fox Bookstore. We are a small independent bookstore located in Marion, Iowa. We opened in July of 2020. We've survived the pandemic and one of the worst natural disasters in our area, the derecho, a month after we opened. We are just 360 square feet with a whole ton of heart. We love hosting events like this, virtual and in-person events, and I'm so delighted to be bringing these two authors to you today. And just to tell you a little bit about them, CJ Carey is a novelist, journalist, and broadcaster. She has worked at the Sunday Times, the Daily Telegraph, and the BBC, among others. She also writes novels under the name Jane Thine and lives in London. So welcome, CJ.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thank you.
And we also have Greer Macallister joining us. Bestselling author Greer Macallister's historical novels include The Magician's Lie, Woman 99, and The Arctic Fury, have been named Indie Next, Library Reads, and Target Book Club and Amazon Best Book of the Month picks, and option for film and television. As G.R. Macallister, she is the author of the Five Queendoms series, which Paste Magazine called the best feminist fantasy series you probably haven't read yet. A regular contributor to Writer Unboxed and the Chicago Review of Books, she lives with her family in Boston. And today we will be talking about CJ's books, Widowland, which came out last year, and the follow-up Queen Wallace, which just released last month. So I will hand the stage over to Greer, and she will be our lovely hostess for this evening or this afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Terry. I know we're both really glad to be here. This is an exciting and fun event to do. There are a number of commonalities between the sorts of things that I write about and the sorts of things that CJ writes about. And I think we're just going to go ahead and dive in. I am not in the jungle, by the way. This is a background. But we're going to talk about wild things and how certain regimes don't want wild things to happen. So it felt like a fun thing to do. And you were saying it's kind of a first day of summer, sunny day where you are, right?
Don't want to be in London now. I mean, British people famously talk about the weather, but we've had such a washout that it's very pleasurable for me just to even look at your jungle behind you and think of sunnier places, yes, because London is not really it.
Got it. Been there. So congratulations. Go ahead.
I was going to say, sort of weather is always very important in English literature, and I totally channel the weather in Widowland and Queen Wallace. This idea that because I was trying to create a kind of dystopian environment. The weather was significant. People didn't, it was kind of a rain-washed land, and it felt a bit miserable. And so, those kind of tropes about British weather really, really helped create the atmosphere.
Oh, that makes sense, because you hear the saying sort of geography is destiny, right? Like the place makes the people. The people who are, in Norway and surrounded by cold have different concerns, have different civilization, have different development, have different priorities than the people who are, in the desert where it's hot. So definitely that you feel that in Queen Wallace, this sort of bleakness that the protectorate wants and the people suffer through. So it makes sense that you're sort of folding that in, the stiff upper lip sort of business there. So congratulations on Queen Wallace, or I guess in the UK it's Queen High, and we can talk about titles and things like that if you want to later on. A lot of people who are joining the event probably know the book, have read the book, want to hear more in-depth stuff. But for those who aren't yet familiar with Queen Wallace, can you give us just sort of the logline or the highest level description of what readers should expect from it?
Okay, so Queen Wallace is the follow-up to Widowland, and Widowland is my imagining of what Britain would have been like if, as almost did happen, Great Britain had formed an alliance with Germany and had not gone to war with Germany, and Britain had become a protectorate of Germany. And I was very interested to explore that. In a way, that's a kind of theme, that has often been explored in literature, but I specifically wanted to look at how it would be for women. And so that's really what I focused on. So Widowland is set in 1953, and it's the coronation of King Edward and Queen Wallis, and the leader is coming over from Germany. It's the first time he's visited England, and he's going to be there at the coronation. But there is the threat of an assassination. So there are kind of talks of an assassination threat. So everybody is on high alert. And our heroine, Rose Ranson, is employed at the Culture Ministry, and she works to edit the classic works of English literature to make them compatible with the ideology of Nazi Germany. And if you think of the classic works of English literature, they are by and large written by women, the Brontes, George Eliot, Jane Austen, and they're usually the 19th century works about women finding agency, women becoming individuals. And this would not fit well with Nazi ideology. So what Rose has to do is to slightly adjust them, edit them. She has to, for example, make Lizzie Bennet in Pride and Prejudice a little less feisty, or Dorothea Brooke in Middlemarch a bit less intelligent, or Jane Eyre a bit less self-sufficient. So this is what Rose is engaged in doing. And then she gets involved in a plot, and that's where the thriller starts. Queen Wallis, it takes place 2 years later, and a terrible thing has happened in Alliance Britain, and nobody can talk about it. It's called The Event, and nobody can talk about it. But spoiler alert, it was the death of the leader, the assassination of the leader, and we see Rose again in the Culture Ministry, and we don't quite understand why she's there. So. I don't want to spoil the plot too much, but that's so the sequel is 2 years later.
And the first one is the occasion is the leader is coming to England for the first time, and the occasion of the second one is the president of the United States is coming for the first time. So you've got sort of these events that not event like the event, but these events, these anticipated events that are being organized around, and I just find it so fascinating the way that literature is tweaked. The line that really jumped out to me when I was reading Widowland the other day is the way that you changed the first line of Pride and Prejudice. It is universally acknowledged that a woman in possession of a womb must be in want of a husband, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
So the way that women's roles are codified and presented and promoted in a world like this, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I absolutely took. So I've written many novels before set in wartime and pre-war Germany, and I've always been very interested in the role of women, as indeed was Hitler, and the Nazis were very, very particular about how women should be, and their attention to detail was second to none, and they really believed that women should be told how to dress and how to behave at every stage of their lives. And so I wanted to kind of bring that into Rose's tweaks of literature. But the editing of literature, which is obviously the theme of both these novels, is something that the Nazis thought about very seriously. They weren't the first authoritarian regime in history to think about it, but they took it very seriously. And the inspiration for the whole set of novels began when I read a fascinating book about the Nazi editing of history. Now, we all know, anybody who knows anything about the Nazis and books always thinks of that bonfire of books, where in May 1933, all these books that were degenerate by, say, Freud or kind of Marx were heaped into a bonfire and set alight. What most people don't know, and I didn't know before, was that the Nazis tried to do something much, much more sophisticated in a way, which is that they went through occupied Europe in the 1940s collecting books from libraries and from private collections, history books, and a team of scholars would rewrite these history books so that the history reflected the National Socialist view of history. And I thought, wouldn't it be fascinating if you took that to literature and you had a kind of, you had an Alliance Britain in which literature had to be rewritten. And of course, I was obviously thinking about contemporary resonances in this, but it kind of amused me to rewrite bits of English literature, both kind of little nudges, but also kind of big things. So for example, you know, Jane Eyre, when we all know, she says, "Reader, I married him." She changes that to "Reader, he married me," just so that the man's role is more significant than the woman's. And so, so poor old Rose is set to editing all these books and kind of correcting them. And of course, in the process of doing it, she is exposed to these wonderful works of literature, and she has her own growth. You know, she understands, the shackles fall from her, and she understands.
I noticed in your bio it mentions that you're a journalist, and I know a lot of other authors who are journalists. You find that background, I assume, very helpful in writing fiction.
It's a completely natural transition, yeah. And when I worked in a big national newspaper in London called the Daily Telegraph, and every single person in the newsroom had their own novel in their drawer. Everybody was writing a novel, and I was too. But it has, as you say, been so useful as a writer. I mean, I'm sure, you know, this applies to you too in a way, because if you are assembling, particularly if you're a historical writer, you're assembling a vast amount of fact together. It really helps if you've had a journalistic discipline to marshal all that fact and work out what's exciting and fun. But in a way, that kind of that was a problem also, because in all my previous novels, I'd always striven to be really faithful to fact and event and time, and not get people in the wrong place at the wrong time, or saying something that wouldn't be characteristic of them. And yet, when I came to write these two books, which were alternative histories, I was suddenly making stuff up, and it was at once extremely liberating, but also I felt slightly awkward about it, so that I changed my name. I wrote under a different name to sort of delineate the fact that this stuff is alternative history. It's great being a journalist. It's the best job in the world, apart from the job that we have. It's just, for anyone that is interested in human nature and human beings, it's great fun. So I really cherish the fact that I spent all those years in the newsroom, although I kind of very pleased that I'm sitting here at a desk now. So
good. Well, we are lucky that you write fiction as well, because we get to read it. So let's talk a little bit about research. I think it's sort of, I wanted to ask partly, you sort of already answered it, talking about the tension between the real and the imagined, and you're incorporating real people like Wallace Simpson into this fake world with Rose and everything else, this sort of fork in the road, and trying to, how do you find that line? Do you have a personal guideline to say, okay, well, here is how I establish the plausibility of the direction that this person is going in? I mean, I'm sure you have more material than you can shake a stick at of things that these people actually did say and did actually do. And how do you then put that in the new context?
So interesting, isn't it? And sorry, little shout out for Arctic Fury here, because you have also undergone exactly the same process. You've got real people, and you have a kind of a moral qualm. To what extent, if you're using real people, can you fictionalize what they said and did? And I mean, I would never use anyone who's currently living. You know, I think that, so my situation is I only use real characters who are kind of public characters who are no longer with us. But ultimately, I think in fiction you can actually do anything. So fiction is about making things up, and I think you can pretty much do anything. But I was very, very cautious when I was writing my earlier novels, because it was set during wartime, and you have to be super careful about moral sensitivities. You don't want to have misportray somebody who is, say, the wife of a Nazi leader, or somebody who's responsible for very serious atrocities. You want to take that seriously. So it's a question I've thought about endlessly. But I think ultimately, I mean, if you think of, say, Hilary Mantel, who did Bring Up the Bodies and Wolf Hall, and she uses the figure of Thomas Cromwell and tries to really go into his mind. I think that was a wholly positive thing, and you've got a greater feeling about Tudor England from that. And I honestly think ultimately that fiction liberates you to do anything within the bounds of law. So that's my general feeling. I have in the past felt slightly awkward about it, but certainly not here, because Queen Wallis, who is a character obviously in the novel named after her, and in Queen Wallis she's newly widowed. Edward has died. She's stuck in Buckingham Palace. She's rattling around. The administration, the German administration, don't like the royal family, which they absolutely didn't. They actually didn't really approve of monarchy. They don't know what to do with her, and they're worried about her because she's known for speaking her mind. She's American. She's known for saying awkward things, and President Eisenhower is coming to visit, and they're worried that she's going to say some terrible things to him. And so Rose is sent to meet her and try and kind of get an idea of what she's likely to say. But of course, using Wallis Simpson luckily wrote her autobiography, The Heart Has Its Reasons, and we know very much about what she said and thought. So that wasn't too difficult. And what really helped Greer, and this is kind of a terrible thing to say, but who does an American royal person who hates the British royal family and is longing to go back to California remind you of? Which character? So actually, the fact that we'd had a living British royal who had gone back to California and couldn't stand the royal family was terribly useful to me. So I kind of channeled quite a lot of that. But I mean, Wallis Simpson's such an interesting character. She was extremely feisty, probably treacherous, actually. She was having an affair with von Ribbentrop, who was, in the years coming up to the war, she had an affair with von Ribbentrop, who was German ambassador at that time, while she was seeing Edward VIII. So, I mean, she was her own woman, very much. But I just loved using her. I mean, you want a good, strong character like that. And of course, in the novel, she has a rather terrifying, concealed secret.
Yes. And such a gift to have, if you want to talk about women with and without power, to have a woman as a figurehead a queen, right? People would think, oh my gosh, the queen is in charge of everything. And this queen is not. So she's got to play a totally different game, and is more of an asset, more of a pawn than a queen in this particular chess game. So, or maybe a bishop or something. She's got ideas, like you said.
Yeah, she's in a difficult position. I mean, one of the other things that the book deals with is also a true and rather kind of horrific thing that the Nazis had thought of, and that is the caste system for women. So they've come and formed this protectorate. Britain's become a protectorate. And there's a man called Alfred Rosenberg, who's a real person, who was Hitler's philosopher guru, obviously half crazy. And he was a great admirer of the caste system in India. And he's come along to England. In real history, he wanted England when when the alliance was formed, as they believed it would be, he wanted England because he admired England. So he's been given England and he's running England, and he has divided all the women into one of 6 castes. And the castes have been given nicknames, and the nicknames are all to do with sort of famous women in the Nazi hierarchy. So the top caste are called Gellies. They're nicknamed Gellies after a woman called Gelly Raubel, who was Hitler's niece, who killed herself, and Hitler was infatuated with her. So Gelly is the top, the cream, the best women. And right at the bottom are the Friedas. And that also came from a real thing in World War II. Right at the end of the war, the German population were divided in, for ration purposes, into groups who should get most rations. And the people who got the least food were women over 50 with no children and no man. And they were nicknamed Friedhofsfrauen, which means cemetery women, because they were useless. They were of no use to society, so they didn't need any food. And as soon as I saw that, as soon as I discovered that, I thought, oh my God, I want to write a thriller in which these characters, women over 50, who have no children and no man, are the heroines of the whole thriller. And in Widowland, they've been herded together into sort of slum areas called Widowlands, nicknamed Widowlands. And they have to live together, and they have hardly anything. And yet they are the ones who remember literature. They're the most literate ones, and they love books. And so they're the heroines ultimately. But the caste system was something that could have happened, you know, it was kind of real. And I was very struck by it.
And I think some readers would say, you know, oh, classification, that reminds me of The Handmaid's Tale. But it's what it really is that authoritarian regime wanting to control women is, of course, naturally going to label them based on their function in society.
Yes,
yes. And so you've got the childbearing ones and the not childbearing, the cemetery women. That's just, it's such a powerful idea, such a powerful name. I'm glad that you built so much around it. And to have that group be heroines, we don't get to read that all that often. So thank you for that.
I mean, it is incredible. I remember when I was writing my Clara Vine series. I've got a series about an actress called Clara Vine, who's a British agent in Germany during the war, before the war. And I was researching it, and I was walking in Berlin on the edges of the Havel Lake, and there's a very beautiful little peninsula with lovely, lovely houses, and it was where all the VIPs had their houses, like Hess and Himmler and Goering had little beach houses there. And I saw this sort of mansion. I recognized it, and I couldn't remember what it was. And I went and found out about it, and it was the first bride school. It was a Berlin bride school. So as early as 1935, Himmler, in fact, had set up these bride schools. And if you wanted to marry someone in the SS, you had to have a 6-week residential stay at this bride school where you would learn to cook and hem curtains, but also, interestingly, where you would learn to tell fairy stories to children in the right way. So, for example, if it was Cinderella, the handsome prince would be a stormtrooper, and the ugly sisters would be Slavs. So it was, I was absolutely struck by this, and I thought, and I kept that thought, that idea that you would train women for certain parts of society. But the rewriting of fairy stories, which is something that they were very, very strong on, I used in these novels. So Rose,
it's amazing. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so Rose gets to rewrite fairy stories so that they have, so they have the right message.
Well, controlling, teaching the children, right, is a number one sort of way to control the future. So that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Hitler, who isn't mentioned in these novels, but Hitler did say that the most important citizen in Germany is the mother, because he recognized that, you know, if you can get the mother to indoctrinate the children, then you're home and dry. And so, yeah.
And it's again sort of that interesting idea of women and power, which is the women are completely powerless, but so important. But that importance doesn't translate into them getting what they want or being educated or anything else. It's translated into, okay, you're going to fill the role that society needs you to fill, and we will praise you for doing the thing that we want you to do, right?
And that is something you're interested in too, isn't it? I mean, you've actually, you know, your novel is about women who are actually doing something unexpected. So, I mean, that's you know, I think it's something that a lot of us are interested in at the moment, and you know, and we're exploring it. And I've always thought, you know, women are the hidden half of history. I mean, it's a saying, but it's obviously true. And it's about time we did begin to dig and find out more about them and what they were actually doing.
Right. And I think there's so much more room for nuance in historical fiction. And sometimes if you want to investigate certain stories or you want to tell certain stories from the past, historical fiction is the only way you're going to be able to do it at any depth, because the women were either not in the historical record to begin with, or they were at some point eliminated from the historical record, either deliberately or not, but often deliberately. The stories, when I was doing research for my fantasy series about a matriarchal world, I was reading about famous female leaders from history. And so many of them, like if you think about Cleopatra, who was incredibly powerful and successful, the stories reduce her to, ooh, isn't she sexy and pretty? And that's why she's powerful and successful. But the chances that the real Cleopatra was only powerful and successful because she had a beautiful face and a body she was willing to use for her purposes, that doesn't seem very likely. So you have to sort of look for the story behind the story and fill it in. I wrote a historical novel about the first female private detective in the US who was hired by the Pinkerton Agency in the 1850s. And even when I went to the Library of Congress and read the Pinkerton Agency archives, they still only had about 5 mentions of her in the actual agency archives, partly because the Great Chicago Fire burned a lot of the Pinkerton Agency records, and all of her career was before 1871. But you can't tell Kate Warren's story in a book-length work of nonfiction because there just isn't enough in the historical record to draw on. So if you want to tell her story, you're telling it in sort of short form, or you're making it up and trying to create a story of the type of woman who would have done the things that we know that she did. So
exactly. I mean, the real joy is, and I was so lucky when I was writing about, well, I mentioned that Wallace had written her own book about herself. And when I was writing about the Nazi wives, because I was very interested in what it was like being married to somebody who committed atrocities, whether if you're married to von Ribbentrop or Heydrich or Goering or Hess, what was it like? And what was great for me as a writer was that at the end of the war, when the Americans and the British and the Allies came in and occupied Germany, all the wives of the senior men, the ones that were still alive, were herded into a sort of a detention camp, and they got to hang around there for quite a long time. And so what they did was they wrote memoirs, and this is incredibly useful. So these memoirs, I mean, you know, a couple of them are published in English, but most of them are still in German. So I had to kind of plow through the German, but these were really useful because they were their kind of apologia. You know, the wife of Goering's wife or Heydrich's wife. You know, this was the way they saw it. You know, Heydrich's wife wrote a memoir called My Husband, the War Criminal, but actually it was a self-justifying novel. And so it was really, really interesting that was the way I actually got to see what they really thought and said. And so we are dependent on our research as historical writers, although the unutterable bliss of writing alternative history is that you can take that framework that you know about and you can make assumptions. You can conjecture, which I also believe is a really important role. I think you should conjecture. I think this word, what if history, we ask ourselves, what would have happened if? And so the Widowland series is a what if. What if Edward VIII had stayed on the throne of England and he hadn't abdicated and gone off with Wallace Simpson, which so nearly happened. And I think life would have been very different. England would have made an agreement with Germany, and so America would not have got involved in the war. So a lot of things would have stemmed from that. And I think it's very productive to ask questions of history. I don't think it used to be rather sort of scorned. And now I do believe people understand that it's a way of exploring history. Why did it happen in the way it did?
And I think people understand better now than they did some number of years ago that history isn't real either.
Yeah, of course.
We know stuff that happened, but the stuff that is written down is not necessarily like the true happenings. It is a person's perspective. It is a selection of detail. And therefore we can look behind the curtain a little bit more, or ask the questions, like you were saying. I love thinking of it as like interrogating history, the historical record, to learn more about what it was like then and figure out more about, the present and future. It's all part of the same. The past, present, future, the alternative present, alternative future, alternative past, are all sort of in conversation. So it's interesting to think about that way.
It is. And I loved writing these songs, but I also, and I don't know about you, but I really, really wanted to write a mystery, because I've got a short attention span, and I always want to know, if you write a whodunit, or you write something where it's moving to an explosive close, I think you can keep the reader hooked. And I do think, that very much appeals to me. So I did try to write a very fast moving thriller, we call them in England, but I think America call them mysteries. But that was really important to me, to write something that set over a very short period of time, that was very fast moving, and you knew something awful was going to happen at the end. And so towards the end of Widowland, we're building up to this visit by the leader, and I call him the leader through the book. I'd never call him Hitler, but what we do know about Hitler is that he was obsessed with the libraries. And so the leader, when he comes to Britain for the first time, he wants to visit all the famous libraries in Britain. He's much more interested in that than anything else. And so he goes first to Oxford, to the Bodleian Library, the Radcliffe Camera, which is, if anyone knows Oxford, it's the famous picture of Oxford with this lovely domed building that I used to work in. And I thought, I used to sit there writing my student essays, so I thought it'd be a wonderful place to have the climax of a thriller, and to have the place where Hitler is assassinated. It'd be great. So that's effectively what I planned. Yeah.
Wonderful. I could ask questions forever. I do want to remind people who are watching that you can ask questions by typing them into the chat. You should be able to see it there on your screen. We're going to keep talking, but we'll see what pops up in terms of questions. I think we talked a little bit about the research process. I'd love to talk about your writing process. It's always interesting to me to hear what other people are up to. And like you said, this is this alternative history gives you more freedom, but you have to come up with more things. You're synthesizing and producing and, recording your cast system and things like that. Do you write faster or slower, or do you have the same process that you use regardless of genre? I'm curious.
It's very useful to have a historical framework, so that you. I'm super interested in history, obviously, and so I'm always reading deeply about the period I'm writing about, and I'm very fixated on the Second World War. So, but what I actually do in my writing process is I sit down in my office at 9 o'clock, and I write till lunchtime. It's grim, it's really grim. The dog sits there by lunchtime, the dog is just desperate to go for a walk. So we go for a walk, and I may or may not have any worthwhile work in the afternoon. But having been a journalist, the great thing that journalism teaches you is that if you set yourself a word count and you say, I have to write 1,000 words today, you can do it. You can do it. It may be terrible, but you can do it. And actually, I always say to anyone that wants to write, just put the words on the page, even if they're terrible. They're there on the page and you can edit them later, but don't spend hours thinking what is the best word for me to start this novel with. Put it down on paper first, because there will be so many drafts that you go through. So that's one of my many tips. I'm always like throwing out tips, but it's tough. Writing is a solitary business. Don't you find?
I do. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because different parts of the process are extremely isolating, and then parts of the process are extremely collaborative. So I think we produce that draft, we produce that first bit in isolation, but I find my work is always so much better when I'm showing it to beta readers, when I'm working with my agent and editor to refine it. I need other people in the process, and I'm not, I would be a terrible self-published person because my ideas on covers are always bad. My promotion ideas are not always good. But I think it's really interesting. There are times, and I'm a pretty introverted person, but I love doing things like this, where we're talking about books. I can just sit and talk to somebody about books for an hour.
So I don't know if you know, so I used to be married to, my late husband was a thriller writer called Philip Kerr, and it was fantastic being married to a writer, because we would sit down after the kids had gone to school, we would sit down, drink coffee and talk about plot and what was happening in our books. And that was just fantastic. And he was much more productive than me. And then he died. He died at 62, which is very young. And after he died, I remember very shortly afterwards going for lunch with an old journalist friend. And he said to me, yeah, Jane would love to have you to dinner. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. When? And he said, but we only have couples to dinner. And I remember being very shocked and then walking home and thinking, oh, I'm living in Widowland. And then thinking, oh my God, that's a great title for a book. And running home and writing actually what became the synopsis of Widowland. But I mentioned that because in every situation, there is, something you take from it. And really the root of Widowland, the novel, was partly that feeling of suddenly, existing in a different social strata. And I'm quite sure many or anyone that's watching may have experience of this, where you move from one situation to another situation, you adjust. But as I said, being married to a writer was so useful. And now instead I try out all my ideas on my children, who are kind of Gen Z, so they're all about kind of zombies, and that's different,
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really interesting how it intersects, because we do sort of have not as a rigorous caste system, but you do get put in a box, the mom box. Like if you're a mom at school, there's a great line from a Stephen Sondheim song about the ones who follow the rules and meet themselves at the schools. And my husband and I always joke about how if I'm going in a particular outfit, I'm going to meet myself at the school, because we're all going to be wearing that same outfit, even without a ministry of fashion like you have in Queen Wallace,
which is a real thing.
Oh, I want to hear more about that. So I think you mentioned when we were talking before about a lot of your historical, or a lot of your framework came from history and came from this idea that the Germans actually made a plan. If they were going to ally with England, they set out a bunch of these rules and said, this is how we're going to run England.
This is just incredible but true. They were absolutely certain that they would be running England. And so a man called Walter Schellenberg, who was Heydrich's deputy, wrote a book for basically for other members of the SS, and it was called Invasion 1940, and it was about how Britain runs, who was going to be arrested. So there's great long lists of who gets arrested. People like Noel Coward and Virginia Woolf and Rebecca West, you know, they were going to be arrested. And in fact, Rebecca West said very amusingly after the war, when this book surfaced, people would ring each other up and say, "My dear, are you not on the list?" It became, you know, to be on that list for immediate arrest was a social cachet. But no, they really planned everything. They knew what they were going to do, and so that was useful too, because I could look at this book and see what they had planned.
It's I always find in historical fiction, it's a little different from alternate history, but in the historical fiction that I write, the things that people find least believable are the things that actually happen.
Yes. Yeah.
Or the thing that I'm working on now, I have to tone down this person from history by like a lot to make her plausible as a person who existed in the time that she actually existed. But yeah, having that to draw on must have been a real treasure trove. But you do have the you know, the importance of urgency, the importance of fiction has to make sense. History doesn't always make sense. The past doesn't always make sense, but fiction does have to. So I love the decision to make it a murder mystery. You've got a body show up in the first chapter. That's the number one requirement. And so you want to keep that reader engaged. There are other books to read. There are other things in the world that aren't reading. I mean, I do some of those sometimes. But to give the reader a reason is super important. So
to keep going. And I love that actually, because that's strangely, I'd always wanted to write a novel in which it begins with the body of a kind of, it turns out to be a senior Nazi by a lake, you know, and the detective shows up and tries to find out what's happened. I always loved that idea as the beginning of a book. So I did use that, and that was fun. And now I'm just longing to write a third one, because I feel there's kind of a little bit further to go, you know, just because even though it's obviously a bleak world, the thing is, it's obviously a bleak world, but always there will be people in that world who are individuals, who are the resistors. And I think you write about any authoritarian regime, whether it's even the court of Henry VIII or the Nazis, as in this case, there will always be individuals who kind of slip through the cracks, and it's those we're interested in, and those who give hope. And so, you know, Rose and Oliver, who becomes her lover, are the ones that you root for, because they stand for freedom, and as America does in this situation as well.
I did want to ask, I think I just heard the answer to it, but having written 2 books in this world, I was curious as to whether you were thinking about returning to this world.
I am. A couple of people have said, I really want to know what happens next. And I find myself longing to write it. I'm writing a completely different novel at the moment, albeit set in 1938 and a murder mystery, but which is super fun to write. But I think I will definitely do a third Widowland very soon. I can see some questions here.
Yes, let's take a look.
A question about poker, which is, of course, Wallace Simpson's favorite game, and very, very important to the plot of this novel. And indeed, that's why in English the novel's called in England, the novel's called Queen High, because Queen High is a poker hand, and it's a poker hand in which you just have one queen and everything else is, you know, not so good. And of course, I wanted that to be emblematic of Wallace alone in Buckingham Palace. But also, Wallace was a fiendish poker player. And when she was married to her previous husband, and he was stationed out in China, she found herself desperate to make some money, and she would hold poker games, and she made useful money out of cards. And so she brought this back to England, and she and Edward VIII, as he became, were fanatical bridge and poker players, and would just, that's all they really liked doing, is just like kind of having parties and playing cards. But it becomes a very important thing in the novel because she plays a very key poker game with some senior Nazis, and what happens at the end of the game is significant. But yeah, she was a keen poker player, and she was a very adept woman. But I think she was, it's really interesting for my new novel, I've been looking at some of the MI5, that's the Secret Service transcripts of what they discovered about Wallis before she actually married Edward. But she was going out with him and seeing him, but she was also seeing and having affairs with other men, and she was being followed by the Secret Service unknown to her. And then they discovered that she was actually having an affair with von Ribbentrop in 1936, and they were incredibly alarmed about that because she had access to the most secret classified documents of the English state, and she was making visits to the German embassy, and so the Prime Minister of the time, who was called Baldwin, authorized the opening of the diplomatic pouch. So he said, you can open the Germans' diplomatic pouch, which they did, and they found that she had documents. So that was very important.
Wow.
I wonder if Terry is Terry telling us that our time is running out? No.
Well, I think we need to make sure that we get to some of these questions that are in the chat.
Absolutely.
So I was curious about this as well. Jessie is asking, is Rose's character based on a real person?
Not really, Jess. I mean, no, she's a heroine, and I didn't want her to be, she's named after my mother, but I didn't want her to be sort of super brave. I wanted her to discover the bravery within her and the courage within her as she goes along. So she starts out a bit sort of a bit more gauche and naive, and she's having an affair with a married man, you know, much against her wishes, but she is. So no, she's not based, other than being named after my mom.
Love that. And then the next question is, do either of you have a favorite book or author? Where do we even begin? I'll give you one of my favorite authors and one of my favorite books of that author. I have always been very influenced by Margaret Atwood and was a huge reader of her stuff, especially in college and graduate school. Not just for, you know, The Handmaid's Tale, and sort of, I really admire writers who are capable of doing amazing things in multiple genres. Like currently R.F. Kuang is doing these amazing things. She has this amazing satire of the publishing industry called Yellowface. That's a contemporary novel, but she also has this amazing, sorry?
I'm longing to read that. Yeah.
It's so good. It's very, very good. I listened to the audiobook, so I highly recommend the audiobook. And then she also has an entire fantasy series and a fantasy book called Babel that's about the power of translation. And it's sort of an alternate England, alternate world where magic and silver enable England to manage their entire empire. So anyway, so R.F. Kuang is sort of the current writer I admire in an amazing way for crossing genres. And Margaret Atwood is historically the author who I feel that way about. And my favorite book of hers is called Lady Oracle, and it is about a writer. So probably that's why I like it the best. But it's about a woman who writes poetry, but also she also crosses genres. So maybe that's what I'm just fascinated by, is all of these different identities. She has a different identity for writing Gothic versus her, you know, feminist poetry and all of that stuff.
Well, I suppose my favorite, all-time novel has to be Middlemarch, which I do think is very George Eliot's sort of huge, wonderful novel, which has such a huge span of characters, and she is such an astonishing and wise writer. So I love Middlemarch, but recently I've been reading such a lot of espionage fiction because that's something that interests me a lot, and I'm very, very keen on John le Carré, who wrote Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and so many other novels. I think he's amazingly good, and so I'm very into that. I mean, I think espionage is really popular as a sector here, and I understand why, because I think we're living in a world where we increasingly feel we're under surveillance. You know, we're being watched, whether it's by social media or just we're in a hypervigilant world. And that's what espionage is. It's about spies watching other people. And I'm sure that's why there's this huge surge. So I would have to say, yeah, John le Carré, he's great.
And that sort of leads into another question that I had, which is, when you read for pleasure, do you read in the genres that you write in, or you read in others? It sounds like espionage. Correct me if I'm wrong. You don't write espionage, right? Or you haven't?
Oh no, I do. I've got lots of spies in. No, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I would regard it as espionage. Absolutely, because it's about people. I mean, Rose is a spy in Queen Wallis, effectively, because she's undercover, and I love the idea of people not being what they seem, which is obviously central to fiction anyhow, you know, but how do you discover what somebody really is? So I love the idea of spies, and yeah, absolutely. So I kind of do read in that genre, I suppose. I mean, I like a thriller. I like something fast moving, and but also, you know, like I just reread Persuasion the other day, Jane Austen, and it's so fantastic to. Another thing I do think is that the modern age is so information laden and almost and you know, baffling and occasionally bleak, that to go back to a different world such as Jane Austen's world is just a mental balm. It's just pleasurable. So yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that we talked just a little bit about censorship and book banning, since they're so important in the novels that you're writing, and just what you just said about being able to go back and read something from a different time. And we sort of started out with,
should we be allowed to see people as they genuinely wrote and thought? And that's such an important question. And so we all know at the moment that all sorts of books, Agatha Christie, P.G. Wodehouse, Ian Fleming, are being rewritten to reflect ideas that are more contemporary. And is that good or is that bad? I tend to think it's almost always bad, because I don't think it's going to hurt people to be exposed to ideas of people at the time. You know, I mean, we can't make everything better. We can't fix history. You know, history is, people did think like that. I think there is a point at which you do not want to expose young children or things that are really gratuitously offensive. I can see a point in, for example, I'm not even going to say it, but there was a famous Agatha Christie that's been renamed 3 times because the original title was considered really offensive. And I agree with that. And I think, do not give gratuitous offense, but at the same time, to rewrite all the nitty-gritty of books in order to make James Bond seem more kind of caring and female friendly, it's pointless. That's what Ian Fleming was like. That's what history was like. So I think we don't need to be so terrified of it.
And to slide to a different point on the spectrum, where you're talking about young children, the idea of certain, especially in the United States currently, administrations banning books that even show, people of other ethnicities leading their lives, civil rights figures. They're saying, oh well, these books aren't appropriate for children. It's not appropriate for children to read about gay people, because that's indoctrination, as opposed to heterosexual, relationships, which are not indoctrination.
Well, you can
based
guess
on
what I think about this. I mean, I think people should read widely. I think books shouldn't be banned unless there's very few exceptions. Like, for example, the Anarchist Cookbook, which had lots of bomb making material. I can see that, you know, instructions. I can see you might ban that. No, I think people should be exposed to the thoughts, the creativity of people of all types. I absolutely think that books should not be banned, and it's very frightening that people with different agendas are restricting our cultural lives. Yeah, it's awful.
And it is a favorite tool of authoritarian regimes. And with your history background, and you've done so much on this, can you say a little bit about why that, why is book banning something that the Nazis were doing? Why is it something that other, administrations have done?
You're completely right. It's been a favorite tool throughout history to rewrite books and to restrict books. Because it's a way, I mean, books are very powerful. I have a little bit in Widowland in which Rose can't believe that she's coming into contact with an unfettered human mind. You know, somebody is speaking to her from either like the 5th century BC or from the Yorkshire moors. It's a moment where you, on your own, are coming into contact with another intelligence. And of course, any regime is frightened of that because they don't want that to happen. They want to insert themselves and be a filter. But so it's always happened, and I'm just alarmed that it's gathering pace. When I wrote Widowland, which was only a few years ago, it wasn't as prevalent as it's become in the last few years. I mean, it's almost, it's terrifying to think that at the speed with which it's gathering pace.
I agree. Welcome back, Terry.
Hi. Well, we are getting near the top of the hour, and if anybody has any more last-minute questions, you can drop them quickly in the chat, and we'll get to them. But we are coming up to the top of the 1 o'clock hour here in the Central Time Zone. So I want to thank Greer for graciously hosting and asking all these amazing questions, and for CJ for joining us all the way from the UK. We appreciate it. We will be open tonight from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. So if you're looking to get a copy of one of Greer's books, I know we have Arctic Fury, Girl in Disguise, and one more in stock. Of course, we have, those are the two we have in stock right now. Sorry. Queen Wallace, and we have Widowland in stock of CJ's as well. So.
Oh, can I just say thank you so much, Greer. That is really, that's such a thorough grilling. And also it's such a joy to talk to another writer. It's really pleasurable. So I'm just really grateful also, Terry, for giving us the chance. It's, I feel that we could go on quite a lot longer.
Oh, yes. Well, if you are both ever in Iowa, come by the store, say hi. We'd love to host you.
Coming straight there, Terry. Coming straight there.
Great.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Maybe those of you that are local will see you tonight at the store. Have a good day.